What happens when this carrier strike group arrives in the Mediterranean?
So I think we're looking at two parallel courses of events. One is the carrier strike group arrives in the region. It presents the president with options to strike the regime in Iran to back the protesters, as he promised earlier. The other is promises that the Iranian regime is making to pretty much anybody they can find inside the Trump administration, that they will come to the table, give up their nuclear program, give up their missiles, work with us. And so the question is really how seriously the Trump administration takes these Iranian promises that are made in desperation, and how much he wants to do something that he will be remembered for, I think, for posterity, which is to help to topple the most dangerous regime in the Middle East.
And what do you replace that regime with?
That's an outstanding question. And anybody who predicts revolutions ends up looking like an idiot in hindsight. And I'm not game to look like that big of an idiot. I don't know what comes. There are a number of options. There is the son of the Shah who lives in the United States and who is very popular and has said he wants to preside over a transition. That's very important. He doesn't want to restore the monarchy. Then there are people inside Iran. There are bad guys, too. There's the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the elite military that controls all the terrorist groups and is also responsible for regime protection. They are also in the mix. So there's some possibility of bad to worse, but there's a stronger possibility, I would say, of bad to better.
Interesting. To what extent do you believe Iran has managed to rebuild its nuclear capability as well as its ground-to-air defenses? If we were actually flying jets into that country, what would they face?
I don't think that the Iranians have done enough necessary to defend themselves on the surface-to-air front. The real deterrent that the Iranians have is one that they have used previously, and that is that they have been working very hard since last summer's Israel-United States strikes on their nuclear program to reconstitute their ballistic missile program. And what they're threatening is not, we will shoot your planes from the sky. What they're threatening is, we will hit civilians in your allied states, whether in Israel or in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia, as they've done before. And that's a pretty powerful deterrent in the region. On the nuclear front, they are determined, they're making progress, but very substantial damage was done, and that's not going to be something that they break out of anytime soon.
Interesting. What would they put up in the air? Are they still flying F-14 Tomcats? Is this like a 1980s movie?
You know, in their dreams, it's a 1980s movie. If anybody remembers the Top Gun Maverick, you know, that sort of scene. But the reality is that the Iranians are not capable of deploying any really serious defenses, and we have seen that time again in multiple Israeli strikes and in American strikes.
Well, Danielle, this was a real trip around the world this week with Davos and the many areas that the president decided to weigh in. I could bring up Greenland right now, but I want to ask you about what the heck is going on with Canada. Those very tough words that we heard from the president this week. Canada lives because of the U.S., to the point where you've got Mark Carney making a trade deal with China. He was also disinvited. Carney was disinvited from the president's Board of Peace. Listen to the rhetoric between these two.
Canada gets a lot of freebies from us, by the way. They should be grateful. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that.
Canada and the United States have built a remarkable partnership in the economy, in security, and in rich cultural exchange. But Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian.
Are we done here, Danielle? Have we broken up?
Well, in reality, the United States and Canada have been broken up for many years now when it comes to foreign policy and national security. As trading partners, we're never going to break up. They're our neighbors, and we need them. You know, the problem here is that everybody likes to criticize President Trump for his irresponsible rhetoric, for his over-the-top statements and criticisms, but they don't criticize our allies for rising to the bait. They like to pose themselves as the grown-ups in the room, but the reality is that Davos and other meetings like that end up looking like a group of 14-year-old boys in high school. Having been a 14-year-old girl, I would just say the best thing to do in these circumstances is to listen to the president, nod your head, and move on. I understand that's difficult in a democracy. You want to prove, Mark Carney wants to prove his manhood to the Canadian people and that he's standing up to Donald Trump. But you got to do the right thing for your country, and that means not behaving like a 14-year-old boy.
Wow, that's something. I'll tell you, the president
Sorry,
is...
I know you were a 14-year-old boy as well. My apologies.
Don't worry. I didn't trust 14-year-old Joe Mathieu anyway. Let me ask you about what's going on very quickly with Keir Starmer, who had some very tough words to the president, who said that the U.S. never needed NATO and accused our European allies of, quote, staying a little off the front lines in Afghanistan. Here's what Keir Starmer said in response.
Let me start by paying tribute to the 457 of our armed services who lost their lives in Afghanistan. I will never forget their courage, their bravery, and the sacrifice that they made for their country. There are many also who were injured, some with life-changing injuries. And so I consider President Trump's remarks to be insulting and frankly appalling.
I've only got 30 seconds, Danielle. I apologize in advance. Is this more acting like 14-year-old boys?
Look, this is Donald Trump acting like a 14-year-old boy, and I rarely agree with Keir Starmer about anything, but insulting and appalling are correct. The reality is our allies did stand by with us in Afghanistan. The British were probably the most useful, most important military that stood with us in Afghanistan, and the president shouldn't say things like that.